the town that danced itself to death. A heavy summer heat hung over Strasbourg in the year 1518, pressing down on its narrow cobbled streets. The city's half-timbered houses leaned over lanes alive with murmurs of discontent. Recent years had brought famine and sickness. The people were weary. In the dim light of dawn, there was a feeling that something was about to break the uneasy calm. Even before the first cry of the market hawkers, an inexplicable tension crackled in the air. Strasbourg's residents had learned to live with fear. Fear of hunger, fear of plague, fear of divine wrath. Under the Gothic spires of the cathedral, they prayed for relief. Yet on this morning, a different kind of omen stirred. It was as though the city itself held its breath, waiting for an unknown doom to reveal itself. As the sun climbed higher that day, a lone figure stepped into one of Strasbourg's crooked little squares. It was a woman in a simple woolen dress, known to her neighbors as Frau Trophia. Without a word, without a violin or drum to urge her on, she began to dance. Her arms rose and fell in graceful arcs. Her feet tapped and slid over the worn stones. At first, people smiled in confusion at the sight. Was it a joke? A moment of madness? Frau Trophia did not stop. Minute after minute, then hour after hour, she continued her solitary dance. She twirled and swayed as if possessed by a gentle but unyielding force. Sweat beaded on her brow in the summer heat. Shopkeepers and passers-by paused to stare. What began as an odd curiosity soon felt unsettling. There was no music, no laughter, only the soft shuffle of her worn shoes against stone, and the thump of her heart keeping time with an invisible melody. Night fell and Frau Trophia was still dancing. By the light of torches, neighbors watched in dread and fascination. She moved like a marionette on invisible strings, unable to rest. When dawn broke and the church bells tolled matins, she was still in motion, exhausted, feet raw and bleeding, yet driven by a relentless compulsion. Word of the dancing woman spread through Strasbourg's tight-knit quarters. Within a day, shockingly, others began to dance as well. A young man who had come to scoff found his legs jerking in time with an unheard tune. An old beggar woman shuffled forward, arms trembling as she twirled. One by one, more townsfolk were seized by the same wild urge. Some cried out in confusion even as their bodies pirouetted without mercy. A handful of dancers turned into dozens. In taverns and workshops, whispers grew. A strange madness was afoot and no one knew who would be next. By the week's end, the city was in an uproar. In the main square and along the Rhine's canals, clusters of afflicted dancers spun and staggered day and night. Onlookers gathered at a cautious distance, clutching their rosaries or covering their mouths in shock. Families of the victims pleaded and prayed. A husband grasped his wife's arms, begging her to sit and rest, but her body only swirled away from his grasp as if enthralled to a distant piper. Mothers wept as their sons jigged and convulsed, unable to respond except with exhausted eyes full of terror. Rumors flew like swallows at dusk. Some whispered that a curse had befallen the town, perhaps an angry saint or a demon released from the depths. Others insisted it was a sickness of the mind, a mass delusion spread by fear. The most superstitious recalled tales of Saint Vitus, the patron saint said to punish sinners by making them dance. In any case, Strasbourg had never seen anything like this. The air itself felt charged with panic and a creeping sense of doom, as more and more feet pounded the cobblestones in that horrible, ceaseless dance. Day after day, the dancing plague ground on without mercy. What began with one woman had swelled to scores of citizens, perhaps a few hundred at its feverish peak. They danced through blistering afternoons and starlit nights alike. Many moved with their eyes shut or rolled back, faces fixed in uncanny serenity or rictus grins, even as tears of pain streaked their cheeks. Their clothes became drenched with sweat. The cobblestones grew slick with the blood from battered feet. Bodies began to break under the strain. Some dancers collapsed, limbs finally giving out after endless hours of motion. A few never rose again. Onlookers would rush forward to carry away those lying frighteningly still, their faces ashen. Whispers of death swept through the crowd each time a dancer fell limp. Yet even that grim fate did nothing to stop the others. Those still in the grip of the dance kept shuffling and twisting, as if deaf to the cries around them and blind to the bodies of their neighbors being carted away. It was a nightmare made real, a torment of endless motion that turned flesh and bone fragile. The people of Strasbourg grew desperate for a cure or at least some relief for their loved ones. Families tried everything they could imagine. In a narrow alley, a brother poured buckets of cold well water over his dancing sibling, hoping the shock might awaken him from the trance. But the young man only sputtered and kept jerking to his feet, resuming the awful jig with chattering teeth. In the cathedral, priests led special masses and whispered exorcisms. A trembling mother dragged her dancing daughter before the altar of the Virgin Mary, begging for divine intervention, but the girl's feet never ceased their feverish tapping even as incense smoke curled around them. Others resorted to force. A group of neighbors bound one exhausted dancer with ropes, tying her to a bed in a futile effort to still her thrashing limbs. All night she writhed against her bonds, eyes wild with a terror that reflected in those watching. It was no use. Come morning, her bruised ankles were still twitching to an invisible beat. Every remedy born of reason or faith failed. The affliction was beyond the reach of ordinary medicine or prayer, leaving the city grasping for answers in the dark. At last, Strasbourg's authorities stepped in. By lamplight in the halls of city governance, the magistrates conferred with the town's physicians and priests. The room was thick with tension and the smell of sweat and candle wax. All could hear, even through the shuttered windows, the faint echo of shoes scraping against stone in the distant square. The madness was everywhere, and it threatened to drag the entire city into chaos. The chief physician, his face drawn and pale, offered a diagnosis that was more humoral than supernatural. In his learned opinion, this was a sickness of the body, an excess of hot blood churning in the dancer's veins. It was causing an overstimulation of the senses, a fever of motion. His prescription was startling: let them dance it out. If the afflicted could just exhaust the sickness through continuous dancing, perhaps the spell would break. After heated debate, the council agreed to this unconventional remedy. It seemed like the only plan left. Better to embrace the dance, they thought, than to watch it tear their people apart. With a mix of hope and dread, the city leaders set their drastic plan into motion. In the days that followed, Strasbourg became host to a ghastly festival of enforced dance. The council had wooden platforms erected in the market square and cleared out guild halls to give the throng of dancers more room. Musicians were hired, drummers, fiddlers, pipers, tuning up lively melodies that rang out across the city. They even enlisted strong men and a few healthy volunteers to prop up the weak and keep the exhausted bodies moving. If a victim stumbled to the ground, hands would hoist them upright again, pushing them back into the fray. What the town witnessed was a bizarre spectacle, a kind of stage-managed delirium. To any outsider it might have looked like a lively fair or a manic celebration, but the faces of the dancers told the true story. They were gaunt, hollow-eyed, some sobbing even as their legs kicked in time to the relentless music. The cheerful jigs and reels played by the musicians clashed horribly with the sight of people trapped in their own bodies, terror and fatigue etched in every line. The hope was to cure them through excess, to drive out the devil by giving him his fill. But as the music echoed off stone walls and the sun beat down mercilessly, it felt as if the city had made a pact with darkness itself. The cost of the council's cure became painfully clear within days. Far from purging the illness, the frenzied marathon only pushed the dancers closer to their graves. At the height of the mania, it was said that dozens collapsed daily, and the death bells in Strasbourg tolled repeatedly each evening. Under the relentless strain, hearts gave out and lives flickered away. One afternoon, a young craftsman who had been dancing since dawn suddenly let out a final gasp and crumpled to the ground. The fiddles kept playing as his mother's wail cut through the square. He was not the first to die that day, nor would he be the last. On the edges of the crowd, fear and anger began to bubble up. Bystanders muttered that the cure was worse than the disease. The city elders watched in horror as their plan backfired before their eyes. This was no remedy at all, it was a dance of death. Guilt and desperation weighed on the council. They had tried to master the plague with reason and music, and in doing so perhaps they had tempted the very forces of evil. With heavy hearts, the leaders finally ordered the musicians to stop and the stages to be torn down. The experiment had failed, leaving Strasbourg more frightened than ever and littered with the broken bodies of the innocent. A pall of dread settled over Strasbourg. In the wake of the failed cure, the council forbade all dancing and music anywhere in the city. Taverns fell silent, and even wedding celebrations were hushed. It was as if any melody or rhythmic step might reawaken the curse. The only sounds of dance that remained were the shuffling feet of the afflicted, still drawn by the unseen piper that only they could hear. Their numbers had thinned, but dozens still danced on, scattered through the streets like ghosts that refused to rest. With worldly solutions exhausted, the people's thoughts turned increasingly to the divine. Many were now convinced that this was the work of St. Vitus's curse or perhaps a devil's touch. Churches overflowed with worshippers begging forgiveness. The clergy led processions through the streets, swinging censers of fragrant incense to cleanse the air of evil. Some of the devout, in their terror, even chose to join the dancers intentionally, praying aloud as they moved, hoping that by offering themselves in penance they might appease the wrath of heaven. Fear ruled every heart. By candlelight at night, families huddled together and wondered if the dancing plague was a punishment for their sins, and whether faith was their only hope of salvation. At last, a new plan took shape, one rooted in faith and repentance. The clergy, with the council's blessing, decreed that the remaining dancers must be led to a holy place for divine intervention. They set their sights on the shrine of Saint Vitus in the hills, a spot long sacred to that very saint whom many blamed for this curse. If Saint Vitus had afflicted them, perhaps Saint Vitus would show mercy and cure them. Preparations were made in solemn earnest. The authorities had special shoes fashioned for each afflicted soul. A sturdy pair dyed red as a symbol of martyrdom, each shoe marked with a painted cross. Priests sprinkled the shoes with holy water and murmured Latin blessings over them. One by one, the still dancing sufferers were gently gathered and made to don these red shoes. They were given small wooden crosses to clutch in their hands. It was a strange procession, pale, swaying figures with crimson footwear and vacant eyes, flanked by determined priests and grim-faced town guards. As church bells tolled, Strasbourg watched in hushed hope and dread while the convulsive parade of dancers was ushered out through the city gates, headed toward the distant mountains in search of a miracle. High in the pine-clad hills, the procession reached a small stone chapel dedicated to Saint Vitus. The air was thin and cool compared to the swelter of the city. Here, under an open sky and the watchful gaze of carved saints, the final ritual began. Priests led the dancers to the chapel steps, voices rising in Latin hymns that echoed off the mountainside. Clouds of frankincense billowed, and the scent of holy oil mingled with the pine breeze. Inside the chapel, a simple altar bore a wooden icon of Saint Vitus. One by one, the dancers were brought before it, their crimson shoes shuffling over the threshold. Holy water was sprinkled on their heads. Prayers for mercy and absolution rang out. What happened next felt like something out of a sacred tale. As the prayers intensified, the convulsing feet of the afflicted began to slow. Many sank to their knees, trembling not from dance but from sobs. Some collapsed entirely, lying still for the first time in weeks, breathing raggedly but free of the uncanny compulsion that had driven them. A few uttered cries of gratitude or astonishment as feeling returned fully to their limbs. It was as if a dark storm had passed and in its wake, the people it had possessed were finally released. In that hallowed place, under the eyes of Saint Vitus, the dancing plague was at last broken. In the days that followed, a profound stillness fell over Strasbourg. The last of the dancers returned from the mountains not as twirling marionettes but as weary human beings, leaning on walking sticks and the arms of friends. Early autumn leaves skittered along the streets as if to welcome them home. The ordeal had ended as mysteriously as it began. The city that had been haunted by constant motion was now oddly quiet. Every footstep on the cobbles sounded like a blessing in the absence of that cursed dance. Recovery was slow. The survivors of the dancing plague were gaunt and frail. Many bore bruises, bandaged feet, and distant gazes from their time lost in the frenzy. Families embraced their returned loved ones with tears of joy and sorrow mingled. But for every joyful reunion, there were candles lit for those who never came back. Dozens of lives claimed by exhaustion or heartache during the plague's cruel course. The people of Strasbourg tended to the living and mourned the dead. Neighbors brought bread, broth, and comfort to those who had collapsed in the dance and now needed care like convalescents after a long illness. Slowly, the rhythms of daily life resumed, tentative but blessedly ordinary. Yet a question lingered in everyone's eyes. What exactly had happened to their town and why? Autumn deepened and life slowly found a new equilibrium, but Strasbourg could not so easily forget the summer when dancing became death. The story of the plague was told in hushed voices over tavernalish and at family hearths. Children grew up hearing of that terrible summer as a cautionary tale, one that made them shudder at the thought of music on a hot July day. For months, no one dared to dance even at festivals. The city's fiddles gathered dust, and its drumskins stayed silent. People stepped carefully, almost solemnly, as if any exuberance in movement might invite the curse back. City officials recorded the events in their ledgers, though even ink on parchment struggled to capture the surreal horror of what had transpired. The Strasbourg Chronicle of 1518 spoke of a strange mania that had seized the populace, an affliction beyond natural understanding. In churches, priests gave thanks for deliverance and warned against the excesses of sin that might bring such punishment again. Yet, behind the relief and the rituals of gratitude, an uneasy question nagged at the survivors' minds. They had witnessed something that defied the normal order of the world. In the quiet after the storm, the mystery of the dancing plague hung in the air, unresolved and unforgettable. Years turned to centuries, and the tale of the dancing plague of 1518 lived on as one of history's most haunting enigmas. What really happened in Strasbourg that summer? Even now, no one can say for certain. Scholars and storytellers alike have pondered the question. Some modern historians suspect it was a case of mass hysteria born of stress and fear, a psychological contagion ignited by the hardships of famine and disease, then fueled by the fervent belief in St. Vitus's curse. In that view, the dancers were victims of their own minds and a collective dread so powerful it seized their bodies. Others have pointed to a more tangible culprit, ergot, a toxic mold that infects rye bread and can trigger hallucinations and muscle spasms. Perhaps, they wonder, the people of Strasbourg had unknowingly eaten tainted grain that set their limbs twitching and their visions reeling. Yet no theory fully dispels the eeriness of what occurred. The dancing plague remains a ghost from the past, its truth dancing just out of reach. It stands as a reminder of how little we sometimes understand about the human mind and the mysterious forces that can grip a community. In the end, the town that danced itself to death leaves behind a simple, chilling legacy. A question that may never be answered, echoing through time like the faint memory of a distant drumbeat.